He had already won. By every calculation, every military principle, every lesson history had ever taught, Napoleon Bonaparte should have crushed the British and Prussian armies on June 18th, 1815. He had done it hundreds of times before, but on that single Sunday morning in Belgium, something went terribly wrong. And by nightfall, the greatest military mind in human history would be finished forever. This is the story of Waterloo. Not the version that glorifies the victors, the raw, unfiltered account of how Napoleon had everything, and lost it all in 9 hours. Napoleon Bonaparte had returned from exile on the island of Elba just 100 days earlier. Europe's monarchs were terrified. In a matter of weeks, he had rebuilt an army of 120,000 soldiers. Veterans who loved him. Men who would die for him without hesitation. Against him stood 2 armies. The Duke of Wellington commanding British and Allied forces, and Field Marshal Blücher leading the Prussians. Together, they numbered nearly 200,000 troops. Napoleon's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Strike before the 2 armies could unite. Defeat them, one by one. He had done this his entire career. Divide. Isolate. Destroy. On June 16th, 2 days before Waterloo, Napoleon executed the plan perfectly. At Ligny, he personally crushed the Prussian army. Blücher was thrown from his horse and nearly killed. The Prussians fled north in chaos. Everything was going exactly as planned. Napoleon then sent Marshal Grouchy with 33,000 men to pursue the Prussians, to make sure they could never regroup and come back to fight. This decision, this single order, would haunt Napoleon for the rest of his life. The morning of June 18th began with a mistake that had nothing to do with strategy. It had rained heavily the night before. The fields around the small Belgian village of Waterloo were soaked, muddy, nearly impassable. Artillery wheels sank into the ground. Cavalry horses stumbled. Troops marched through ankle-deep mud. Napoleon delayed his attack. Instead of striking at dawn as he normally would, he waited until nearly noon for the ground to dry. Those lost hours would cost him everything. Wellington used every minute of that delay. He positioned his troops with extraordinary skill along a ridge called Mont Saint-Jean, using the terrain to hide his forces and protect them from French artillery. He placed his men just behind the crest of the hill, invisible, protected, waiting. At 11:30 in the morning, the battle began. Napoleon launched his first major assault against a fortified farmhouse called Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank. It was meant to be a quick diversion, pull British reserves away from the center, then punch through the middle and split Wellington's army in 2. But Hougoumont refused to fall. A small garrison of British guards held the compound with extraordinary courage. Napoleon, frustrated, began pouring more and more troops into the assault. What was meant to be a supporting attack became an obsession. By the end of the battle, 12,000 French soldiers had been sucked into this single farm complex. 12,000 men who should have been used elsewhere. At 1 in the afternoon, Napoleon received alarming news. A large column of troops had been spotted approaching from the northeast. Napoleon's officers worried it was the Prussians, the same army he thought had been destroyed 2 days ago at Ligny, now regrouped and marching back into the fight. Napoleon dismissed the concern. He told his generals it was Grouchy's men, the 33,000 French soldiers he had sent to pursue the Prussians. He was wrong. It was Blücher, the old Prussian field marshal, despite being nearly killed 2 days before, had rallied his broken army through the night and was now marching directly toward Napoleon's right flank. Grouchy, meanwhile, was miles away. He had heard the cannon fire at Waterloo all morning. His officers begged him to march toward the guns, to rejoin Napoleon. Grouchy refused. He had his orders. He would continue pursuing a ghost army that had already slipped past him. At 1:30, Napoleon launched his main assault. He ordered a massive infantry attack against the center of Wellington's line, 80 cannon blasting the ridge, then 16,000 French infantry, marching forward in tight formation. It should have shattered the British line, but Wellington had positioned his troops just behind the ridge. The French artillery fired over them into empty ground. When the French infantry crested the hill, expecting to find a broken enemy, they were met instead by a wall of British muskets firing at point-blank range. The attack stalled. Thousands died in minutes. Then came the most catastrophic blunder of the entire battle. Marshal Ney, Napoleon's most aggressive commander, saw British troops moving behind the ridge and mistook them for a retreat. Without orders, without waiting, he launched the French cavalry, 12,000 horsemen, in a massive charge against Wellington's infantry. But the British had not retreated. They had simply repositioned. Wellington's infantry formed squares, tight defensive formations that were nearly impenetrable to cavalry. The French horses crashed against these squares again and again, and again and again. They were repulsed. Thousands of elite French cavalrymen died in those charges. When the infantry could have been decisive, the cavalry was exhausted and broken. By 4 in the afternoon, Napoleon knew the Prussians were real and coming fast. He had perhaps 2 hours before they hit his right flank in force. He made one final gamble. His ultimate reserve, the Imperial Guard. These were the most elite soldiers in all of Europe. They had never in 20 years of war been defeated. Their appearance on a battlefield was a signal of inevitable French victory. Napoleon sent them forward in a final assault on Wellington's center. Everything depended on this moment. Wellington had anticipated it. He had hidden a full brigade of infantry just over the ridge, completely invisible. As the Imperial Guard crested the hill, they were met by a devastating volley from troops they never knew were there. The Guard stopped, and then, for the first time in their entire history, they began to retreat. When the French army saw the Imperial Guard running, something broke. Not just morale, something deeper. If the Guard was retreating, the battle was lost. The word spread in seconds. La Garde, recule. The Guard retreats. And within minutes, the entire French army collapsed into panic. Wellington ordered a general advance. The Prussians, now fully engaged on the right, cut off any organized retreat. What had been an army of 120,000 men became a screaming, running mob. Soldiers threw away their weapons, their equipment, everything. They ran through the night, chased by Prussian cavalry who showed no mercy. Napoleon himself nearly fell into enemy hands twice before escaping the field. 4 days later, he abdicated for the second and final time. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, 6,000 miles from Europe, where he would spend the remaining 6 years of his life writing his memoirs and telling anyone who would listen how he had been betrayed. 9 hours. That is how long it took to destroy 20 years of empire. Waterloo was not lost because Napoleon ran out of soldiers. He lost because of a 3-hour delay waiting for mud to dry. Because a single farmhouse consumed 12,000 men. Because a cavalry commander charged without orders. Because the one general he trusted to pursue the Prussians never heard the guns. History remembers Wellington's brilliance and Blücher's determination. But Waterloo was not won by genius. It was lost by the smallest possible margins, and a man who had survived so much for so long, finally running out of luck on a muddy Belgian Sunday. The greatest general who ever lived walked off that battlefield not as a conqueror, but as a man who would never command again. The losing side